You're all set.
All right, thank you, Gary, and good morning, everyone. Long time no see. I hope everyone is well. And also, I just wanted to say hi and introduce myself quickly to all the new folks that I have not yet met. As Gary mentioned, I work with the Diadromous project out of New Bedford. So this is not going to be a typical talk like the past ones that we've seen. It's going to be freshwater and some estuarine stuff. But hopefully it's interesting and a nice change of pace. So I started with the division in my current position about 5 years ago. And we had some work in monitoring in some of the Taunton River tributaries, but we didn't do much in the main stem, which was kind of curious to me. And so through some casual conversations with colleagues in other agencies, we kind of started talking about the potential to restore the shad run in the Taunton River and what we knew, if there were any fish left, and no one seemed to have any answers. So I spoke with Brad Chase, the project leader, and said, you know, let's figure this out. Let's try and get something done here. And so that was when we started doing some monitoring in the main stem. So I've got a couple pictures here for those of you who aren't familiar with shad. They historically were a pretty popular sport fishery. But disclosure, this picture is not a bunch of fishermen in the Taunton River. It's not even on this coast. If any of this is interesting to you, I would strongly recommend you read some of the history of how American shad took hold on the West Coast. It's a pretty phenomenal story, but I won't bore you with that right now. And this is not a Taunton River American shad, but it is at least from the East Coast, but it's from the Mid-Atlantic.
Oh, sorry, you're not sharing your screen.
Oh. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Perfect. So let me put this back into slide mode. So these are the pictures I was referring to. Sorry about that. And so shad is a pretty big sport fishery. So the Taunton River has a pretty long history of importance as a fisheries resource, dating back to pre-European settlement. Regional tribes, some were resident within the region, but it also attracted seasonal residents for other tribes. And there's been just a long history that in early spring, people just wanted to be at the river so they could harvest fish. And a lot of the fish that they would catch would sustain them throughout the winter. Around the early 1600s is when European settlers started entering the area, and the importance of this as a native resource is even more sort of just reminded by the fact that they were finding historical cornfields and other artifacts, as well as the prevalence of tribes in the area. So the Bridgewater area, which is where the Taunton River forms, it's formed by two tributaries and then becomes the Taunton River proper. The city of Bridgewater was established in the mid-1600s, and it had very limited European settlers until later in the 1600s. As we got into the mid-1700s, the population really began to grow, especially utilizing the rivers as a resource, and the primary economic bases were industrial and agricultural. There was a large harvest of timber and pitch pine and tar. And there was a lot of shipping work done in the Taunton River. Now, there was a historic ironworks just above the confluence where the Taunton River originates, which was really established in the early 1700s. And from the late 1700s into the early 1800s, there was the mill industry just took off. And of course, this meant damming and releasing effluents into the river. So this was when things started to really kind of go downhill a bit. Now, the city of Taunton was a very important early settlement for European settlers because of the herring resource. For about 100 years, regional settlers would come in the spring to access the resource, and they referred to it as Herringtown. And there was substantial harvest, especially into the late 1800s. And of course, technology got better, the gear got more efficient, and there were more people to feed. So because of the anthropogenic effects on the river, primarily damming and the effluent from the factories, and also from wastewater, the resource really started to diminish from around 1920 to 1940. Now, you might note that I tend to focus on herring here. And if you look back at some of the historical state references, there really is a heavy focus on herring. But in the Belding State Report that was published in 1920, he does note that there were 2 major American shad seining stations. And in 1906, in just one location, they were able to catch 2,100 shad. And then by 1913, they were only catching about 500 from 2 different seining locations. So clearly the resource was impacted both from harvest and from the pollution and access to spawning grounds. So DMF has previously tried to understand and restore that shad population. There have been a couple of different reports published. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of detail, but I was able to parse this out. The map that you're seeing was from a report around 1970, where they went and identified the different sediment types throughout the main stem Taunton River to estimate the potential amount of shad spawning habitat. So around 1969 into the late 1970s was when the big push to try and stock American shad, mainly from the Connecticut River, was underway, and eggs were translocated into the Taunton River and the Charles River. Now, upon first glance, these seem like pretty good numbers, but to kind of put things into perspective, a typical female American shad probably has anywhere from at least 200,000 to 500,000 eggs, potentially even more in the really large older fish. So really the first year they maybe put 1 female's worth of eggs out, and at the best year they put maybe 30 females worth of eggs out. So not really quite the numbers you need to jumpstart things. And then in the late 70s, they switched and started translocating adults into the late 80s. But the first challenge is there was no follow-up monitoring. So we don't know if this did provide any increase in the population in the river. But also there's a lot of science showing now that translocating adults might not be the best, because with the stress and the shock of catching them and then releasing them in a different watershed, a lot of fish tend to just go back out to the ocean and call it quits for the year. So we really don't know what happened, if this had any impact or not, but we're hoping that in the future we can get a better handle on some of these things. So in 1969 and 1970, there was a really comprehensive survey in the Taunton River and Mount Hope Bay conducted by DMF. And they conducted monthly sampling trips from October of 1969 to September of 1970. They had both shore-based seining stations and otter trawl stations. So on this map, to make it a little bit easier to see, I've put blue stars over the stations where they seined in 1969 and 1970, and yellow stars to give you an idea of where we were sampling in our current monitoring project. We weren't able to quite hit the same exact locations. Our seining stations are essentially just a function of where we have public access and can easily just get in the river with our gear. So we began our really monitoring in 2017, and we were primarily using shore-based beach seining, at least in the lower and estuarine reaches, just because of a function of the way the river, the morphology. And in upstream reaches, we were using boat-based shore seining, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, I essentially kicked one of my seasonals off the boat and made them stand on the shore holding one end of the seine while we used the boat to kind of haul it around. And we did okay using these methods, but not really ideal. But upstream, it's really well protected, lots of riparian buffer, which is great, but makes it really challenging to get in and sample. We were able in the first couple of years to do a couple of exploratory boat electrofishing trips, which did show some promise. And I did attempt to get out monthly from June through September for our seine surveys. The stations that we sampled each year kind of changed. This isn't a funded project. This was sort of an opportunistic monitoring project, but we did sample the major lower, mid-river and upstream reaches, which I'll show you in a moment on a map. And we also collected environmental data at every station we sampled too. Now in 2019, a little birdie gave me a bit of information that Mass Wildlife had this nice little electrofishing boat. And so we started going out monthly in the summer of 2019 from June through October, and we sampled middle and upstream reaches. For those of you saltwater folk that aren't familiar with electrofishing boats, they become pretty ineffective in higher salinity habitats. So you're kind of limited in where you can sample. And we collected data on the tracks that we sampled and also the duration of sampling. So when I refer to the lower watershed, this circle, this red circle down here is where I'm talking about. And then this upper circle is what I'm referring to as the mid-river. Somewhat arbitrary definitions, but the lower reach can get pretty much full salinity at high tide, and this mid-river reach doesn't quite get there, and you see more freshwater species there. And those of you not from the area or not familiar, the Taunton River watershed is indicated on this upper map panel. I'm going to apologize for the Google Map images. I still have not gotten my GIS set up and need to work with IT to do that. So I figured this was the best option available for now. And then finally, this is the reach that I'm calling the upriver reach. And I kind of cut it off within the Taunton watershed, but that's about the farthest upstream we could make it because of channel depth and also obstructions, natural obstructions, but still impassable. So this is just a quick summary of what we did. The graphs on the left are showing you the number of hauls conducted in each river reach in each year, and the months are indicated by the different colors. You can see that July 2017, we were really ambitious. We got out in the boat and we kind of just went crazy and did as much as we could. We were also trying to scout different locations. And then you'll also notice that in 2020, our sampling kind of dropped a bit, which we all know what drove that. And so then the graphs on the right are showing you the mean number of fish that were caught per haul. So we definitely saw higher numbers of fish in the middle of the summer, especially in that mid-river habitat. A little bit of a thermal refuge, also probably some juvenile fish hiding out from predators. And we're not really going to compare 2020 because we had lower effort, and we were also trying to be a little bit more cautious when we were doing our boat electrofishing. So we were only collecting data on Alocenes and Menhaden. So we kind of skewed the data there a little bit. Same thing on these graphs on the right side, but a little bit different, showing the number of species we caught. And you can see again, the mid-river summer catches just had the most diversity. And again, we're not really counting 2020, as is the story with pretty much everything in life. So what did we find? We caught about 41 finfish species. So we had 8 different Diadromous species, which is pretty consistent with the historical surveys, with the exception that the surveys in the 60s and 70s did document rainbow smelt, which we have yet to find any. But I was pleasantly surprised that we caught some Atlantic tomcod, which you can see here in the lower right. This cute little transformer sea lamprey was probably one of the things I got the most excited about. He was adorable. We caught him electrofishing and it just kept latching on to the side of the tank. We also see some pretty good sized striped bass. We've caught all of those obviously by boat electrofishing. They're not in shallow shore habitats, but that was also an interesting find. So a little bit more detail on what we caught. I parsed out the river herring by juveniles and adults. I didn't separate by species because we weren't consistent in IDing by species. You know, we had some pretty big catches, so I didn't want to keep them out of the river any longer than I had to. And also it can be a little challenging, especially with the juveniles. So I decided to be consistent and just use river herring here. But it's also notable that we did see some pretty small river herring, which might not be the standard in all watersheds, but this is the size range that we were seeing. Some nice size striped bass and eels and a lot of white perch as well, especially in the mid-river reaches. But of course, our focus here is American shad, and we caught 13 juveniles. So there definitely is a remnant population, but probably not very big. And you can see in this image, those of you familiar with Olosines and distinguishing between the species, on a couple of these fish, you can see that straight jawline. So these were in fact juvenile American shad, in case anyone's questioning my IDs. And to break it out a little bit more, in our lower reaches, again, I have some maps for reference on the bottom here. We mainly saw juvenile river herring, and we caught those few Atlantic tomcod. The mid-river reaches, we saw, again, juvenile river herring, the nice size striped bass, eels, white perch, and some of those few American shad that we caught. And then in the upper reaches, is where we found the adult river herring, some more striped bass, eel, and a few juvenile American shad. So for our marine and estuarine catch, because I'm sure you are more interested in seeing what other cool things we caught, we had a pretty good selection. And I've also compared what we are seeing with the 1974 seine and otter trawl survey. And so I've indicated here the species that were caught by those surveys. And there were only a couple of species that we caught that they didn't. And any questions on my juvenile marine fish IDs, they all came from Vinnie Manfredi and Mark Szymanski, and a little bit of help from John Boardman too. So if anything looks wacky, I brought all these pictures to them because I was very confused by most of these little guys. We also saw some pretty good freshwater species diversity. I had to throw in this very angry snapping turtle that we were lucky to seine and no one got hurt and our net did not get destroyed. He was not a happy camper. He was only caught once. We've never had any other issues with that, thankfully. And we had some pretty good freshwater species diversity and some pretty good sized predator fish as well. You can see this nice bowfin, some pickerel, and then some largemouth bass were the main predators we saw. So a little bit more detail on what we were seeing. You can see the upper reaches. We had some pretty good sized fish, especially with the bowfin, largemouth bass, and our white suckers. We also saw some menhaden in the upper and mid-river reaches, coming in mid to late summer for spawning. And then a lot of your just common freshwater species, sunfish, darters, fall fish, killifish, those types of species as well. And some pretty large white suckers too. We did see a good number of those. The mid-river reaches, the size distribution starts to drop off a little bit, except for we did see some nice sized bowfin in here. I should also point out that I did omit the diadromous species from these just to kind of minimize the excessive number of species on each graph. And the interesting thing that we found in the mid-river reaches is that there's a certain spot where the Taunton wastewater plant, which does have tertiary treatment, but where their effluent comes out, we would get within a certain distance of that effluent and the water would just explode. That's reflected here. That was a lot of the largemouth bass, a lot of the sunfish, the bowfin, some of the black crappie, lots and lots and lots of white perch in there, and also the white sucker. A lot of these other species, especially the more estuarine and marine, were further downstream in this reach. But those freshwater and estuarine species were definitely most abundant in that specific spot. The lower reach, you'll notice that our size distribution scale drops off pretty dramatically. Clearly, this is used mainly by juvenile fish as a nursery. We did catch a few bluefish in there, a good number of winter flounder, sheepshead minnows, sea robins, silvers, lots and lots and lots of silver sides. I'm sure my seasonals were scarred by the nets full of silver sides at just the wrong time of year, but pretty good amount of diversity here as well. So what are our options to kind of work to jumpstart this American shad run that we seem to still have, but a pretty small population? So those folks that remember me from back in my seasonal days up in Gloucester, this is a throwback slide to credit that. I have a nice picture of when we were stocking juvenile shad in the Charles River. And so the idea is that we'll hopefully be able to do something similar to what was done in the Charles River in the Taunton River and work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Hatchery in North Attleboro using Connecticut River broodstock to spawn out juveniles and stock with OTC marks. And we do intend to keep our monitoring program going and hopefully get some good data on how the population indices change when hopefully we're able to start this stocking program in the next couple of years. And so with that, I want to thank my colleagues at Mass Wildlife in the fisheries group, especially Steve Maddox, who brings the shock boat down every month and drives it around so that we can have a lot of fun, and Becca Quinones, all the seasonals that helps lug that beach stain around the Taunton River watershed, especially Trevor, who got to have some fun electrofishing. Jarrell did not get to have as much fun electrofishing, but somehow they came back for multiple seasons, and a lot of other folks. And also the Diadromous project. I dragged a few of our staff out to help with this a few times, and I appreciate all the help. So with that, I will stop and answer any questions that folks have on this.